Hi, and
Yeah.
welcome to the Adversity Psychologist Podcast. I'm Dr. Tara Quinterillo, and today, really excited, Friday, end of the week, with a perfect guest. I have Dr. Yvonne Waft with me. Would you like to say hello and tell us a little bit about who you are and what's brought you on today?
Absolutely. Hi, thanks for having me on. I'm really, really excited to be here today. So I have recently been writing a book about both my personal and professional experience of trauma and coping with trauma. So I'm a clinical psychologist who qualified probably nearly 20 years ago. And I also have a sort of pre-story in that at the age of 19 I had a very traumatic illness, and prior to that I hadn't had the best of upbringings either. I had quite a lot of I suppose childhood trauma wouldn't be an unreasonable way to put it, just in terms of a very angry, aggressive sort of father and a mother who couldn't really protect in that context, and quite a lot of criticism and bordering on emotional abuse growing up, I would say. So there's that kind of context, and then there's this awful illness that I had. I had meningitis with septicemia at 19 years of age, which left me with a physical disability. So there's all of that in the past, and there's kind of, the various ways I sort of stumbled through all of that and tried to find ways to manage and cope. And then there's kind of the story of, following all of that, trying to make sense of it all in my own head. I found my way into studying psychology. Because it kind of, I don't know, it sort of felt accidental at the time, but I think there was a part of me kind of really trying to make sense and understand how I'd got to where I was at that point. And then psychology degree led to sort of a curiosity about clinical psychology. And I think there was a part of me thinking, I want to kind of maybe provide what I didn't get when I was ill and when I needed it. And I felt there was a lack in my care. There was a lot of practical, medical, physical care.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah.
But very little emotional care. And I certainly wasn't getting that from my family because of the context prior. And so I really needed actually a clinical or counselling or health psychologist, to come in and kind of help me with all the physical changes to my body. I mean, dramatic physical changes to my body, losses that were extreme. I actually physically lost my legs, both legs above the knee. So I wasn't really going to be able to walk again. I was going to become a wheelchair user. So I really needed someone to help me through that. And I really didn't get that level of psychological support that I needed. And so I was left with this sense that there was something missing from my care. And that was something I wanted to redress the balance in the future. So that kind of led me into clinical psychology, which I entered as an older sort of trainee. I was in my mid-30s when I started my doctorate in clinical psychology, whereas a lot of people are a bit younger than that. So I didn't qualify till I was nearly 40 as a clinical psychologist. But I've been doing the job for, quite a few years now. And I found myself then specialising, I suppose, in treating trauma, treating kind of post-traumatic stress kind of conditions. I'm not big on the specifics of diagnosis unless I'm doing a legal assessment.
I was going to ask about that.
I'd rather just keep it a bit loose. I keep the diagnostics a bit loose. We talk about trauma rather than PTSD and, the after effects of trauma. Because people are more complex than the diagnostic categories, really, aren't they?
They are. And there's so much, was all right to say, because I will come back to this again later as well. But there is so much around at the moment about, changing perceptions around diagnoses. And so that's just really interesting in your work, because there might be some kind of preconceptions about how a psychologist would do an assessment and then a formulation and come up with that plan. And I think it's really interesting because we were talking on air, off air actually, before we started recording, which is always when the best conversations happen, I always think, about this kind of shift in psychologists starting to use personal experience and bringing that into the work that they do. And we've probably been qualified around the same amount of time. So when I did my training, that was a big no-no. You know, there was, you know, boundaries were very rigid, and I'm actually really liking this, and I'm starting to do it more myself, bringing in that lived experience, which has kind of led to your book. So let's bring that in now. So you've written this book. Is it all right to just let us know? Because I also love how it came about as well, because I think it's really important for the public to kind of know what psychologists do outside of the clinic room, what other things we're working on to try and help people.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an organisation called the ACP, the Association of Clinical Psychologists, which I'm a member of. And about 3.5 years ago, I got an email that was just sent out to all members of the ACP from one of the directors, who's called Sarah Swan. And I don't think she's a director there anymore. I think she's left that role. But she'd had this idea. During the pandemic, she'd actually had an experience of breast cancer and a journey through the treatment for that. And she'd had the idea that writing about her journey through breast cancer and writing about it both from the lived experience perspective and from the perspective of a clinical psychologist working with people who experience adverse conditions, adverse situations, might be a really helpful angle for a book. So she started writing her book, Coping with Breast Cancer, which is now published and is available. And alongside doing that, she had the rather brilliant idea that there must be other stories out there among clinical psychologists, probably among many other types of psychologists as well. But because she was working specifically with the ACP at the time, and because she is a clinical psychologist, this was the angle that she took: clinical psychologists with lived experience. There must be loads of stories out there. Let's invite clinical psychologists who are members of the ACP to commit pen to paper, finger to keyboard, and write their stories. And I saw that email, and a little bit of me thought, oh no, I couldn't possibly. And another bit of me thought, why not? And somehow I pinged back an email really quickly and said, yes, I've got a story. And that was about 3 years ago. And it's taken most of the last 3 years to get that story written and drafted, redrafted, edited. And it's actually going to be published on the 12th of December. And it's called Coping with Trauma, with the subtitle Surviving and Thriving in the Context of Overwhelming Events, I think. Something like that anyway.
Which is so exciting, and congratulations, because I particularly love the fact that it's that, you know, the ultimate, what we call leaning in, sharing that personal experience, which I guess that's why it fits so well with this podcast. I'm so glad when you wanted to come on, that people have so much in them in terms of how they're able to cope with stuff, and we can add a little sprinkle of psychology on top. And the thing that I really love, and we're going to come on to as well, is kind of maybe the misconceptions that people might have about when you have trauma, how you can manage it, you know, whether it is something treatable. What are your thoughts on that? Let's dive straight in, because I really love the philosophy of your book and trying to break down some of these myths or barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really strong idea out there that, you know, the only valid version of trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is diagnosable. And people have sort of stereotypical views of what that looks like. So you might have the sort of soldier who's come back from Afghanistan. He's seen his friends blown up. He's withdrawn. He's drinking heavily. He's exploding with rage at tiny things. He's very isolated. He's isolating himself from friends and family. He's very disturbed. He's, I don't know, leaping under the dining table at the slightest noise outside. And there's this very sort of extreme kind of stereotype of what PTSD is. And I think trauma and its impacts is much, 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 much broader than that. And I think we've seen this sort of in clinic settings over a long period of time, where people are coming with things that aren't quite as dramatic as the combat experience, say. And but all sorts of other experiences, from maybe serious things like sexual assault or physical assault, beatings, childhood abuse, childhood neglect, but lesser things as well. Car accidents can cause those kind of trauma experience as well. Being bullied in school is something that, is an experience that a lot of people have, and it can really impact what you believe about yourself, what you think about yourself, and how you then present yourself to the world. So it might not look like a classic sort of trigger for PTSD. Getting picked on in the playground might look, well, everybody gets that, don't they? That's nothing to talk about. But it's the impact it has on how you believe about yourself. If you start to believe, I'm not worth it, I'm a terrible person, I'm not good enough, and then you start going into the world with that belief and acting as if you're not worth it, as if you're not good enough, then the world will respond in kind, and you will get beaten, you will get treated badly, you will get walked all over. And that is the impact of trauma. So it's not always as obvious as, yes, I saw all my comrades blown up in the middle of Afghanistan or Iraq. It can be something as sort of everyday, I suppose, as childhood bullying or bullying in the workplace. It can chip away at your sense of, I am worth it, I do deserve better, I'm a good person.
So much. I'm just thinking, just what you've said there, it's just, I think that'd be quite profound for a lot of people to hear, because I think there's a lot of invalidation, isn't there? A lot of minimizing about what people go through, because perhaps there is that original kind of baseline of, well, this is what trauma is. And as you say, when I trained, trauma was PTSD. Things started to shift after 9/11, didn't they? When people were watching what was happening on telly, and people started to experience what were trauma symptoms. But according to diagnostics then, unless you were in a situation with immediate threat to life, you wouldn't have got a diagnosis. But it's just so interesting that how many people may be experiencing adverse traumatic events and things like vicarious trauma. I had somebody on a podcast recently talking about that. People in the front lines, police, fire, who might be seeing really horrific things. How validating to know that your experience matters. And then obviously what's really important, and you put it so eloquently, is just what that can then mean for your own cognitions, how you live your life, and how you may respond and other people respond. So in terms of your book then, because what I really love is there's something about the impact of it, the complexity. There's all the stuff around how the brain and body kind of play a part in trauma. But I really love this idea of healing and that misconception. Is that something you're able to enlighten us on a bit more? This idea of, how manageable it is, whether trauma is just with us and that's how it is, because there's a bit of that out there. What is your take on healing?
I think it is very treatable. I think even at the sort of extreme end of PTSD, you can recover, you can survive, and you can thrive. And I don't believe that it's something you're stuck with for life. And I get a little bit irritated when I hear from people, oh, well, this is never going to go away, of course. Or, this is a lifelong condition. No, it doesn't have to be. It's very, very treatable. We have, we can cope with it and we can survive. And there are lots of things we can do ourselves. And that's what's in my book, is kind of the self-help angle. There's lots of stuff from psychology that you can read about, you can put into practice. I mean, just things as simple as finding people who are supportive of you, finding, dare I say, your tribe, your people, finding the people that can help you and support you. Things like joining, I don't know, activities that might give you another angle on life, give you another perspective. I mean, I absolutely love swimming, and I also got into wheelchair basketball after becoming disabled. And finding my people among athletes and swimmers and basketball players, and being able to sort of see other wheelchair users surviving and thriving in the wheelchair basketball world was transformational for me. I didn't know that I could have a good life. And it wasn't just about the sport. It was things like, some of the other players that I was coming into contact with had careers. They had jobs, they'd married, they had families. I was only 19 when all this happened to me. So I wasn't at that stage of life yet to really think about that, but I was worried because I felt damaged. I felt, I felt a bit less than. But when I was seeing other people with disabilities living their lives to the full, it gave me the sense that I can do that too. So finding your people, really gives you that sort of wider view of what might be possible for you, no matter what you've been through. And I think that's where support groups can be really, really useful. If you are a soldier who's come back from Afghanistan, then maybe, military kind of support, veterans groups might be really, really useful for you. But similarly, survivor groups for people who've been through maybe sexual abuse or childhood neglect, the kind of support groups that might exist for that sort of thing. It doesn't have to be at the level of getting therapy necessarily. Finding your people, finding that support, learning skills. There's so many psychological skills that you can learn. And there's so many technological ways now. I mean, there's books, like mine that say, you could try this breathing exercise. That might just go a little way to helping you calm down when you're feeling overwhelmed. And that's not going to solve your entire trauma problem, but, it might just help you through a moment. But then there's things on the internet now, there's support groups on the internet. There's podcasts on the internet about surviving adversity and, and there's little bits and pieces on YouTube about, exercises you can do, skills you can learn. There's all sorts now out there that people can access to help them cope and survive. And then maybe therapy is then the sort of next level if you can access it.
Ask about that. Yes.
And that's always an issue, isn't it? In the UK, we're very, very lucky that we have an NHS, but we are very aware that it has been, significantly defunded over many, many years, and mental health has always been kind of the poor relation to physical health. And I think people do really struggle to access mental health support on the NHS at the moment. Good quality treatments are out there, but they're very, very hard to access. And then
we see a lot of that in the media, don't we? And I wonder if that makes a barrier, if that makes sense, that people might. And I think already what you've done today is almost kind of demystify this idea that it has to be straight to therapy. Obviously, we've got to do our due diligence here. If you're somebody who is experiencing really high intensity, high frequency issues, go to your GP, absolutely get that help. But there's so much you've said about what we have in us, the self-help, the connection with others, that shared lived experience that can also play a really valuable part in that.
Absolutely, it can. Absolutely. And we all know there's things we could do that would make our lives better. Things like, self-care, going and getting a massage perhaps, or going for a walk, or I don't know, taking 10 minutes to mindfully drink a cup of tea instead of, slurping it down while we're rushing to our next thing. We all know we all know that there's things we could do. Absolutely. And we could make our lives better. And actually, if you are really struggling with, for example, the after effects of trauma, then putting that bit of time into doing those things is going to reap rewards for you, I think.
And just the compassion bit on top.
Being kind to yourself about it, and actually accepting that this is actually really difficult, and I need to just look after myself through this. Absolutely.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that actually many of us could probably, I used to say this, I used to run groups in the NHS, and after a little while I used to say to the kind of attendees that you guys could probably now go away and run a group, but be compassionate in terms of, we might know it, but there's often blocks to how we use it. And as you said, what's really lovely, so we've got two psychologists here this morning. There are times when we will know what we need to do, but don't do it. And just being compassionate with that. And what I really love actually then, I'm going to come on to another important bit, is you've talked about so much there about it's the importance of self-help. I sometimes think self-help gets a rough ride as this kind of, oh yeah, I'll try that, but I need to go and do this, formal therapy. But self-help
Yeah.
sometimes might become this kind of fearful thing. I've got to do it all. But I like the fact you said just small things. It doesn't have to be a huge thing, just lots of small things. Having that compassion for the days where even those small things might be hard, but keep trying. But I like this difference between survive and thrive. What is the difference then? Because someone might be listening going, well, what is surviving versus thriving? Is there an answer to that question? How can we help people think a bit more about what that might look like?
I suppose it depends. It's going to be different for every person, isn't it? And I suppose surviving is getting through day to day and not feeling as though you need to end it all, I think. That would be surviving. And I think that's a very real experience for many people who've been through trauma. When you're constantly reliving experiences, you're being reminded of an event, the slightest thing brings it back to you. Sometimes it just feels too hard to go on, and that is when you really need to go to the GP and get some help for those immediate kind of risks to yourself. But in those moments, sometimes just taking a long, slow breath and maybe doing something nice for yourself, maybe just making a really nice cup of tea, or going and having a long hot bath, or going and lying on the sofa with a snuggly blanket and a pillow and maybe watching a trashy movie, that can be incredibly good for you, in the sense of, it's just giving yourself a little break and saying, actually, this is really tough. And I'm just going to be kind to myself for half an hour and see how I feel after that. And that might just be enough to bring you back from that thought of, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Like the beginnings of that journey to kind of thriving. Because I was really struck by what you said, actually, when we look at, if it's all right to bring this in, the stage of life that you were at, and then, trying to get in touch with your values, what you want for your life, what your hopes are, your dreams are, and getting a pathway back towards that as well, what might matter to me, and that verging into the thriving rather than the just everyday surviving. I'm not just playing basketball, but I'm forging connections. It's helping me think about what I want more of in life. And I thought that was quite poignant when you said that.
And I think then when you kind of find your people and you start connecting with things that maybe give you a sense of value, it kind of snowballs. It certainly did for me, in that, I started playing wheelchair basketball. I connected with all these people. I could see people doing really well with basketball, and I ended up kind of really rolling with that, and ended up getting on the GB women's team and going to Atlanta.
Wow! I didn't know that. That's really brilliant. That's amazing.
So that's kind of where thriving starts to happen. Where you kind of connect with something, and then it just kind of snowballs into maybe a bigger achievement than you ever thought possible. I mean, I'd never thought I was going to be an international athlete before I was disabled, but then the trauma almost unlocked something in me, and the efforts to kind of rebuild my life after trauma led to new possibilities. I can rewrite the script here. I don't have to be this person who was quite anxious, probably quite serious, quite low in mood before my illness, and the illness it was like a reboot. It was like I don't have to follow the trajectory that I was on before. I can totally rewrite the script, and it did open up new avenues for me, and that's, I think, where the thriving comes in. And I think the same thing happened when I started connecting, because I'd always been very academic, and academia I saw as my escape route from a quite difficult childhood. And I'd gone away to college, and then I'd been thrown back there at 19. So I thought I'd got away from home and started building a new life. And then, of course, I'm thrown back home, disabled, not quite sure what my options are. And I'm like, I don't want this. And not immediately, because there was quite a journey of adjustment to go through, obviously, but gradually started to think, academia could still be my escape route. It could be my way to getting off benefits, because I was 19. I was on I could claim benefits. I was lucky. UK sort of disability benefits at that time, mid-80s, was it wasn't too bad. I could have lived that way. Housing benefit, mobility allowance, I could have lived on that and that would have been okay, but it wasn't quite enough for me. And I saw my intellect as a way to sort of maybe make more of my life. I suppose at that time I thought, in spite of my disability, I could still amount to something by using my intellect. And I already had A levels in the bag, so it wasn't such a leap to then a good few years later, I was probably 27 when I went to UEL to do my undergrad in psychology. I'd had a few jobs before then and kind of re-established myself in various ways, and then thought, actually, I need to go back and finish my education now and actually build towards some sort of career rather than jobs, and
there's kind of value in that
psychology
for
just
you.
seemed learning massively, is learning, and then not only learning but then sharing that learning has become, I think, a massive value of mine. I think I will read anything. I will just read and scroll the internet just because I'm a sponge for information and knowledge. And getting back into learning was like the lights went back on, and psychology was just so exciting, such a fascinating thing to learn about, and there were so many connections I could make there. Just, that's me, there's a lot of me in that bit. And so it was so
even
fascinating.
Then there was
then
that personal journey, was there? Sorry, I don't want to cut you off. Even then there was that personal journey coming in, meeting the knowledge and creating that. I want to share this. I like that.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's fair to say that there's always been different sides to me, different parts of me, and we talk about parts a lot in trauma therapy work. But with me, there's always been a really strong sort of, I'm not good enough, I'm an imposter sort of part that was installed in me by my parents, I would argue. And I don't think they're ever going to listen to this podcast. Well, my father certainly isn't, he's passed away, but my mother's not technologically capable enough to listen to a podcast, so that's probably not a risk. But they very much told me I wasn't good enough growing up, and were very critical of me. And so there's always been that part of me that's thought, I couldn't possibly, so whatever I do, there's always a part of me sort of driving forward saying, yes, we can do this, and then a part of me pulling back saying, no we can't. And this has just become really normal for me, and I kind of understand it better now, and I can have a word with myself much better now about these sorts of things, and I can almost have a sort of board meeting in my head of kind of those parts of me and say, actually, no, we can do this, we know we can do this. And so now, I'm doing things, getting involved, I've been involved for a few years now in supervising people in EMDR therapy, which is the main trauma therapy that I use. And I'm a consultant, so I supervise groups, I supervise individuals, I supervise on training courses, so I'm getting involved in the training of EMDR now. And that's all just so rewarding because I'm sharing my knowledge and my skills, and that just feels so much of a leap from kind of where I was at 19, really struggling with the adjustment to disability and sort of recovery from trauma, to now kind of teaching and educating on the treatment of trauma. And that's what I would say is thriving for me. It would be very different for other people. Thriving for someone else might be, I don't know, turning their experience into art, for example. Or I don't know, writing a story about it, or I don't know, or just getting married and having kids might be thriving for someone else who's been through some sort of trauma. There's no right or wrong way to survive or thrive with your trauma.
Which I think is important to get across. It's about your own values and connections and meaning, purpose, what that looks like for you.
Absolutely. It's connecting with what matters to you And if it's family that matters to you, then, maybe even if you can't have your own kids for whatever reason, connecting with perhaps, other children in the family, other people in the family, and being supportive maybe to nephews and nieces, and being that, reliable auntie or uncle who's always there to support people. So thriving can mean so many different things to so many different people. But for me, I think it was about success, learning. I mean, sporting success was a bit of a surprise to me. As I say, I wasn't really an athlete before I was disabled, but that sort of happened. And then career success has just been, a gradual unfolding over many, many years of following, just the next best step, really. And I think that's really important, is just, whatever you're doing, just to take your next best step. Looking at the options in front of you. Do I hide under the duvet, or do I write those few words that I want to write? Or do I go and bake that cake and put it on Instagram? There's so many different ways to just take that next best step, and who knows where that next step will lead. It might lead you on to Bake Off, just taking the example of putting your picture of a cake you just made onto Instagram might lead you ultimately to all your friends saying, get yourself on Bake Off, and who knows where that might lead. So,
the leaning in, we call it,
and do the next thing.
Lean into that tricky stuff.
Exactly.
If the meaning and purpose, they can sometimes be good drivers, can't they? What I love about, because you, in your book, you have a whole section on ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, which is one of the main models that I use. I try and use it in my outside of work life as well. And one of the things that we do a lot in that work is metaphor work. And I loved what you were saying then about that kind of what we call inner critic that rocks up and says, no, this isn't going to be good enough, or what are you doing? But you, that very visual there, that kind of how you almost have the board meeting with your inner critic or inner critics around that table or whatever. In order to get back to what matters. Our brain's really good, isn't it? Trying to protect us by going, no, don't do that.
Absolutely.
But there's something here about value that even with the most difficult of life circumstances, and thank you, I always say this, I'm really honored when people feel able to share their personal journey, because when we look at your childhood and then obviously what happened to you when you were 19, there's a lot of stuff there that could potentially kind of show up, shape how you see yourself, the world, the future, and I think that's really important, actually, that you brought that into your book too, the value, the meaning, to help us get that just that little step from surviving to thriving, which I really like.
Absolutely. And I think, I'll be honest, a lot of therapy has helped on that journey as well at different times. Certainly since becoming a psychologist, I've more and more leaned into actually making myself vulnerable and going to therapy, whereas maybe before becoming a psychologist, I'd have avoided that because it felt a bit weak, or a bit, I didn't like making myself vulnerable. I didn't want to go and talk about the difficult stuff. I'd rather avoid it and just soldier on. And, I think at one stage in my life, that soldiering on was a coping strategy. But I think there came a point in my life where what was a coping strategy actually became a bit of a block to my development as a person and my progress. So I took those leaps and went into different types of therapy at different times. And I'm having some internal family systems therapy at the moment, which is wonderful. I'm loving it. And that very much is about those different parts of self and connecting with those different parts, and uncovering even old stuff that I hadn't thought was that important, but also looking at stuff like I've got a part of myself that's just very, very busy and driven, and really kind of never stop if there wasn't another part of me saying, hang on a minute, this isn't sustainable.
That would fit with your board meeting metaphor as well, wouldn't it? But I guess it is interesting, isn't it? That cultural, I still think in Britain we're still not where we need to be in terms of it being okay to go to therapy. There's still, people still make jokes about it, and I need it, what's wrong with me, all of those really unhelpful things. But I think it's actually really refreshing to hear a mental health professional also talking about that from lived experience as well. And just one of the things that you cover in your book is obviously the impact, how our brain kind of responds to trauma and our body, the relationship between the two. But also I think it's quite important to kind of, help people understand who are listening today, get a taster before they go and get your book and dive in, is that actually our brain can be really unhelpful at times. It can mean well, with all of this, don't do that, hold yourself back, how it responds to things. And I'm just thinking, if people want to find out more about you and start to read your book, what's helpful about, why learn about that? Why do people need to know how the brain responds and how the body responds? It probably sounds like a really silly question, but to someone who's kind of new to psychology or is really maybe new to thinking about trauma even.
Absolutely. Well, I think, a lot of people who come to me, and I'd probably count myself in this in my earlier life, a lot of people who come to me for therapy think there's something wrong with me. Why can't I cope like everyone else? Why can't I succeed in life like everybody else? Why can't I attract a partner like everybody else? Why can't I just get the qualifications, get the good job? Why can't I be happy? Why can't I? Am I crazy? Is there something wrong with me? And particularly where people have experienced trauma, that am I crazy is often a really big feature of what people bring to therapy. I'm crazy. Why do I have these ridiculous thoughts? I'm doing all right in my job, but I think I'm a total imposter. Am I crazy? Why do I have these thoughts about myself? And actually understanding that that's our brain's way of trying to protect us. And it's also just our brain kind of almost splits off into different parts when we go through trauma. And so there's maybe a part that's left thinking, I'm broken, I'm useless, I'm worthless, I'm rubbish. And that part's in there and it shouts up every so often when it feels threatened. But then there might be another part that's soldiering on, trying to get somewhere. And this just totally is me from years ago. There was a part of me saying, no, you can't possibly, you can't possibly. And another part going, but I've got to, and really driving. And so I was always in this kind of push-pull tension between the part of me that felt like an imposter, felt like I couldn't, felt like I wasn't good enough. And the part of me that was soldiering on to try and overcome that. If I just try this next thing, I'll just overcome that and be better. But it was always in tension. It was always kind of, in conflict with itself almost. And that feels a bit crazy when you're in that place of,
kind of
part
tug
of
of
me is
war
really
almost,
driving
isn't it?
forward. Totally. And actually, if you can just drop that tug of war, to use the ACT metaphor of dropping the struggle and just say, actually, part of me really doesn't think I can do this, but another part of me knows I can. So let's just have a go and see what happens. And let's just take our next best step and see what happens.
That's one of my favourites. And I think sometimes, especially with stuff like trauma, and I do hear this a lot in my clinical work, in other bits and bobs that I do, there's almost this, because of the enormity of it for some people, there's this kind of almost, it's like a hook, I've got to deal with it, got to almost like tick a box. And I often think that sometimes that in itself is a roadblock, that we need to maybe just slow it down. What can I do today? What's my best step I can take? And sometimes it might just be in this moment, this 1 minute. And I think actually that can be a really helpful way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. I mean, for people that are really, I mean, for people who are really struggling with the after effects of trauma, everything can feel so totally overwhelming. And, so the house might be getting in a terrible mess. They might not be managing to get dressed. They might not be managing to get a shower or get washed. They might not be managing to feed themselves properly. Just making a cup of tea and sitting down and having that cup of tea might be the next best step that you can take. Or just going to the loo instead of kind of curling up on the sofa, desperate for the loo, but just can't move.
That's pretty powerful, isn't it?
It is. But people can be so paralyzed by what they've been through, and it can feel so overwhelming. And just thinking to themselves, I don't have to clean the whole house or get dressed, but I could just go and have a wee,
literally,
or a cup of tea. Yeah, absolutely. That can be your next best step. And then from there, something else might follow, or it might not, and that's okay.
You just made me think there actually about, if there's somebody listening to this podcast who might be supporting someone or knows someone who has been through trauma, or even if it's many years, just understanding that, because I'm just thinking how you may be able to be that kind of helpful, compassionate, significant other for somebody when you're also able to. I was just thinking what people might be able to get from your book as well is also just the understanding for other people what they're going through, whether that's a work colleague, partner, friend, kind of whatever that is. I mean, so many people listening to this are going to want to go, right, how do we find you? So your book is out on the, run me what date in December it's out?
12th of December. Yeah.
Right. And if people want to find out like more about you, where can they find you? Where do you hang out?
Okay, so I'm on Twitter as Dr Yvonne Waft at Catalyst Clinical Psychology, I think is my handle, or Catalyst Clin Psy, something like that. I'm on Instagram. I'm not very active on Instagram. I haven't quite got my head around it yet, but I'm a work in progress on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn.
Small steps.
Absolutely, just taking my next best step towards learning to do the social media stuff. I'm on LinkedIn. Who am I on there? I'm Dr Yvonne Waft on there as well. Again, I'm not particularly active on LinkedIn. I'm working on that. And I'm on Facebook. I've got a Facebook page, again, called Dr Yvonne Waft at Catalyst Clin Psy, I think is the handle thingy on Facebook. So again, I mean, I don't post loads because I'm one of those people who gets really irritated when I'm bombarded with spam, basically. And I don't want to be that person that's spamming. I feel like I'm spamming everyone at the moment because of this book. And I feel like I'm
spam away. It needs to be out there. But I get
it absolutely does, and I know that, and I need to do it. But at the same time, there's a bit of me thinking, oh gosh, people are going to be so sick of seeing this bloody post about this book. But you know, I am still getting good.
Manage that inner critic there.
Exactly. But you know, as psychologists, we're just as vulnerable to all that as anybody else, aren't we?
Are. I think
sometimes
we're right
more so.
Oh, I am definitely.
I am absolutely. I own that completely. But yeah, I'm on all of those platforms. I haven't ventured onto TikTok yet. That's one I'm not connected with. And I'm sure there's other platforms that I'm not on. But those are the four main ones that I am on. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So people can find me there.
All in the show notes for people to find them, but also a link to get your book when it's out. And we'll get this podcast out before your book's out. So people can click straight on that link. Do it now if you're listening. Get that book.
That'll be fabulous.
I always ask everybody. So we've had loads of. I could probably. No, I need to have you back on again. I say that with so many people. It's just we can't get it all done in one episode. There's so much to come on to. So we'll get you back again if you'd like to come back and carry this. I want to talk a bit more about the brain-body link. Kind of helpful stuff you talk about in your book that we do. You know, learning the difference between what is stuff that we might do. Have compassion for the fact we do it, but it might not be the most helpful. And I think just bringing in those elements you talk about, mindfulness and ACT therapy, which are all really important of that healing journey. But even though you've given us loads, if there was one little adversity takeaway, what might that be? My little signature move.
Do you know what I think from what we've just been talking about? I think I just love the idea of just taking your next best step.
I'm going to steal that.
Taking a deep breath. Connecting with this moment and taking your next best step. And if that's all you manage to do today, that's enough. It's a start.
That's going to be up there with my favourite little adversity takeaways, I think. Thank you so much for coming on, Yvonne. We'll have to tell people. So we've kind of connected before, but I've never actually seen you visually. So it's just really lovely to be able to properly chat and say hi, and hopefully we'll get to do lots more of that, because we're in the same psychology kind of forum where you feel like you know people, but we haven't actually met. It's so lovely to have you on a personal and professional level. It's really made my day. So let's get this episode out there, and then if you're up for it, let's get you back and do a follow-up as well.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much